In this video, I'm going to make a last-minute Christmas gift for my daughter. This is my daughter's old Tic-Tac-Toe set, which unfortunately broke and she tried to fix it. So I don't really have a plan for this project. I'm just kind of using what I have in the shop. And these are some leftovers from my bathroom vanity build. Some leftover cherry square pieces that were from a dado that I cut into leave the doors and the drawers. So I'm going to cut them to length. This is for the main tic-tac-toe grid. And initially I cut them to 10 inches long, but then I realized that it'd be easier to cut them in a length that is actually divisible by 3. So anyways, I cut them at 10 and then came back later and actually cut them a bit shorter to 9 inches. So I need 4 of these to make a grid of 9 squares. And luckily this piece was just long enough for that. And so the way it's going to look is like this. And I'm going to have to join them together, and I'm going to put some dados in basically to make lap joints. And this is where I realized that maybe I should have cut them not at 10 inches but at 9 inches. So I actually ended up marking them, cutting them shorter by an inch. Wasted a little bit of material, but like I said, this is scrap material, so I wasn't too worried about that. Just took a minute or two longer. I'm doing all this on my table saw with this sled. So once that modification was done, I marked out the 3-inch and 6-inch distances to divide these into exactly 3. And then from those marks I went over about, I think, 3/8 of an inch, because these are 3/4 inch wide strips, so that I would have an idea of where to start cutting the lap joints. So just double checking to make sure it looks right. And I'm going to start off by, of course, lowering the blade so that it only goes about halfway. I actually made a mark at the 3/8 inch distance so that I could set the blade height. I'm just going to kind of eyeball it at this point and do a test cut just to see if it's at the right height. Now I could have put in a dado set, but sometimes it's tough with a dado set to get the right width. And so I'm going to just nibble it with the individual blade here. It'll just require a few extra passes. So now I'm just lining up with the outside mark, that's towards the ends. And again, putting my stop block in place, and then I should be able to cut all of them. Realize that I need a better stop block, because this stop block is not great, but it does the trick. I plan to eventually rebuild this sled I think it's a little bit too big. And here you have to be a little careful because your fingers are going to be fairly close to the blade. So if you're squeamish and want to be safer, you could also hold the piece of wood in place with push stick or some other device to keep your fingers a little bit further away from the blade. But with the sled, at least the piece of wood is firmly held in place. And I'm just checking now to see how that looks. And I'm going to use a marking knife to mark off where the second cut needs to be. And then that way I can again set my stop and cut all of the marks. So now the second inside slot, and I'm going to check and just make sure that we've got it right. And once I'm happy with that, I'll nibble out the middle. I believe I had to take off a little bit more, just kind of just kissing it a little bit. And once I was happy with it, I could run the rest of them through. Now you can see that I'm going to now just nibble out the inside part. It just takes a couple of passes with the blade. And it's done. In this case I had to do 3 times. So a dated blade would have been quicker, yes, but I would have had to spend the time to actually set it up. So once those are done, I'm going to try fitting them together. And I want a fairly snug fit, but not too snug. And this one seemed to be okay. And then they can be pressed together into a grid. Which will then get glued together. It was a little bit tight, so I actually ended up cutting a little bit more off each one, just so that it slips together a little bit easier and you don't have to pound it together. Always afraid of splitting the wood if you force it too much. So you do want it to be a little bit loose, but not too loose. You can always take more wood away. I can't put it back, so you have to be careful. So now that it fits together well, I'm going to grab my glue and glue it together. So just using some wood glue and putting a little dot basically at each intersection point. Trying not to put too much on so it doesn't squeeze out, because it's a little bit harder to clean up if it squeezes out. And this is mainly going to be sitting on a table when we play, so it doesn't need to be too robust. Slip them back in. And the good thing with these lap joints is it keeps actually the pieces nice and square as well, so I don't need to worry too much about them being square. And now I'm just going to grab a couple of clamps and clamp things up and then let it dry. Just have to be careful here. As you can see, it kind of fell apart again. The other way to do it would be to put a heavy weight on top. That could work too. But I have my clamps here, so I'll just clamp them together. I don't have enough of these quick grips, so I'm just going to use some spring clamps as well for the other two places. Can never have too many clamps. Once that's all clamped up, nice and tight, I'm just going to move it so it's out of the way and work on the playing pieces. Okay, so using more of the same cedar strip wood that I have left over, I'm going to mark out the actual size of the X's, the playing pieces that are X's. So I just measured, I believe these are about 2.5 inches long, and I'm just measuring out 2 of them, and what I'm actually going to do is cut the lap joints first, so that I'm dealing with a larger piece which is safer to hold. I'm just making X's to make sure that I cut in the right place, and basically rinse and repeat. You can see how I mark them, hopefully. And yeah, basically going to cut them the same way that I cut the grid, the same setup on the saw, and doing exactly the same thing. And then once those are done, you can see I've got lap joints, and then I decided to use my bandsaw actually to cut these, mainly because they are small and I didn't feel comfortable doing this on the table saw, even with the table sled. So we're just lining them all up, and I'm going to just gang cut them all, and just cutting them exactly in half. And once that's done, it's a simple matter of popping them together like that, and we have X's. So these X's need to, of course, be glued together, and so basically, same as I did before, just going to put in a dab of glue and pop them together. And again, I'm trying not to use too much glue so that there's no squeeze out. And one of them I had to re-glue later because I guess I didn't use enough glue. And just the act of squeezing them together spreads out the glue a little bit, so I didn't bother spreading out the glue with a brush or anything else. Any excess glue I just wiped up with my finger. Now to clamp these, I decided to just go ahead and clamp them together with one big clamp. There was a chance that they would get glued together, but like I said, I tried to use only a drop of glue, so there shouldn't have been any glue squeeze out. And this was a little bit tricky to do with just 2 hands, but I somehow managed. And then I set those aside to dry. So with the O's, I decided to actually do them with my hole saws. And so I basically set up 2 hole saws together on my drill press and that will basically make rings. Important to tighten things up properly, and I'm going to actually use some leftover 1/2-inch cherry plywood for this. I didn't have anything that was thin enough, so this kind of worked. And you need to take it slowly because you've got 2 spinning hole saws and it's taking out quite a bit of a chunk of wood. And these hole saws are actually kind of cheap ones, which I'm not too happy with. I need to buy myself a better set. They're a little bit on the dull side. And so for some of these I actually reversed the plywood and drilled from both sides. But then on subsequent ones I just drilled all the way through, just took it really easy. And I've got a block of wood underneath to act as a backing piece so that I don't tear out the wood. And I found that my drill press kept kind of stalling, so I had to take it really easy and back out a few times just to clear out the sawdust. It's important to clamp it in place well so that it doesn't move on you, especially with the hole saw setup. And eventually, I think we got through. Great. Now the problem is getting it out. And these hole saws don't make it easy. So I actually had to remove the hole saw out of the drill press and loosen the actual nut on the end, and keeping in mind that the hole saws were a little bit warm from the friction, so but I managed to kind of separate it and be able to pull out the ring and get out the middle piece as well. So anyways, I continued doing that and made 5 rings, which need a little bit of sanding. The edges are a bit rough. So guess what? Next step is sanding. So I wanted to knock off some of the edges, the sharp edges, especially on the straight pieces. The rings I had already sanded, and so I spent a little bit of time sanding them. And then once sanded, I took some Odie's oil and I just started to put on some Odie's oil and stain it. So the good thing about Odie's oil is it is non-toxic, it's actually food safe, and so I especially like using it on things like toys that kids are going to play with. You know, they're going to touch them, they're going to probably touch their face and so forth, and I don't need to worry so much. I don't need to wear gloves when I put it on. It's actually kind of good for the hands. And yeah, it brings out the natural quality of the wood, especially this cherry. So I spent a little while longer putting on the Odie's, and once it was sat for about an hour or so, I went ahead with a soft cloth and just buffed out any excess oil, and it turned out quite nice. My daughter was really happy to get this gift on Christmas Eve, and we've played a few games with it already. It's going to be something that she'll treasure for a long time. Thank you for watching.